Let's see. Okay, thank you everybody for joining today's webinar on AI and nuclear weapons. I'm very excited for today's event. We have a slate of really fantastic speakers to discuss these important issues. My name is Jack Kelly. I'm an AI research fellow at PSR, and I joined PSR in March of 2024 to research AI policy and particularly understand what are the unique risks posed by the integration of AI and nuclear weapons. My work this year has included research and publishing in outlets such as Responsible Statecraft and the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, as well as mobilizing PSR's chapters and members to support state-level AI legislation. I graduated in 2023 from Harvard with a degree in government and public policy, where I took coursework looking at some of the catastrophic risks related to both nuclear weapons and AI. In January of 2025, I co-organized the webinar about nuclear weapons and AI in partnership with the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, as well as International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War and Pugwash. That event featured speakers Jeffrey Hinton, Connor Leahy, Dr. Ruth Mitchell, and Melissa Park. And the success of that event and its positive reception inspired me to organize a follow-up event to continue the important conversations on these issues. We will begin this webinar with some remarks by each of our speakers to highlight their work and to learn more about these issues. And then we're going to open it up for a Q&A as well as a panelist discussion. This event will be recorded and shared with everybody who's registered afterwards. And I want to thank everybody who helped to make today's event possible, particularly a shout out to Brian Campbell, Julia Morgan, Adam Billen, and Ira Helfand. And with that, I would love to introduce our first speaker of today, Dr. Joe Hodgkin. Dr. Hodgkin is an attending physician at Mass General Hospital and an instructor in medicine at Harvard Medical School. As a member of Back from the Brink, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, and a board member of Physicians for Social Responsibility, he is active in speaking and lobbying for disarmament, de-escalatory nuclear policy, and physician track to diplomacy. Dr. Hodgkin.
Hi, everyone, and thank you to Jack, the organizers, and my fellow panelists. And as Jack just outlined, the focus of my work is on nuclear weapons rather than AI, so I'll comment on the former, and I'm keen to learn more about the latter from the rest of you. There are about 12,000 nuclear weapons in the world today, 90% in the hands of the US and Russia. Many of these are thermonuclear weapons on the order of tens to hundreds of times more powerful than the weapons used in World War II, and many are ready to launch on hair trigger alert. The fact that there's high risk of these weapons being used requires no elaboration given recent headlines. There are two key points to communicate in the work that we do in the organizations that Jack just alluded to. The first, which has been extensively proven with modeling, is that our healthcare system cannot meaningfully respond to the use of nuclear weapons. In my own care of patients, I've seen the brittleness of our system in responding to supply chain shocks and software outages. Because we can't treat a nuclear war, we have a moral obligation to work to prevent it. The second key point is that we can only discuss nuclear weapons if the basis of our conversation is their health and humanitarian impacts. That is, what they do to human bodies and our planet. The epicenter of a nuclear detonation is hotter than the surface of the sun, and all life there is vaporized. The initial flash is followed by a shock wave that throws buildings and other debris through the air, causing severe blunt and penetrating trauma. The surrounding area then consolidates into a firestorm that consumes all oxygen. Those further from the center will suffer from acute radiation syndrome, destroying their blood cells, hair, skin, GI tract lining, and cerebrovasculature. The collapse of transportation, water, sanitation, healthcare, and economic infrastructure leads to starvation and epidemic disease. Those exposed to radiation will later suffer from cancer, chronic cardiac and pulmonary disease, infertility, birth defects, and psychiatric illness. When cities burn in a nuclear exchange, enough soot is injected into the upper atmosphere to drop global temperatures and precipitation. Recent modeling from 2022 shows that even in a more so-called limited exchange, the number of people who starve could be in the billions. A broader war between Russia and NATO could lead to the starvation of as many as 5 billion of the 8 billion people on Earth. As you can see, this remains the most immediate and severe threat to public health and civilization in a time of many threats. Fortunately, grassroots activism has been effective over the past 80 years in addressing the nuclear threat. Our movements have applied pressure, resulting in an 80% decrease in the number of nuclear weapons since the 1980s. So what are we doing to finish the job in these difficult times? In addition to educating, writing, speaking, and engaging the next generation on this topic, we have multiple tactics. In the United States, we have a policy platform that calls for a world without nuclear weapons, as well as intermediate steps to de-escalate the risk of nuclear war called Back from the Brink. This platform has been endorsed by the legislatures of 6 states and most major municipalities around the US, as well as a growing group of federal House representatives. At the international level, our network passed the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons through the United Nations General Assembly in 2017, putting nuclear weapons in the same legal category as biological and chemical weapons and emphasizing the responsibility for total nuclear disarmament, which the nuclear armed states still have under Article 6 of the 1968 Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Half of the countries of the world are now signatories to this treaty, although it has been boycotted by the nuclear armed states. Following in the Track 2 diplomacy strategy, which was so successful in the 1980s, our network continues speaking with a united voice across borders. Since I visited our colleagues in Moscow in 2021 and we released a joint statement shortly before the current war started, we've continued to hold regular joint calls connecting US and Russian physicians and trainees involved in this work. We've been speaking out about the threats of nuclear weapons in parallel to our colleagues speaking out about AI, and I look forward to hearing about the overlap. Last November, Presidents Biden and Xi released a joint statement affirming the need to maintain human control over the decision to use nuclear weapons. To a non-specialist in AI, there are two obvious problems with involving AI and nuclear command and control. The first is the opacity of how an AI program arrives at its recommendations. But the second is that there is never a correct time to launch nuclear weapons. We do not need sophisticated technology to answer that question. So at this point, I'll pass it along to the next panelist to hear more.
Thank you. Our next panelist who we'll be hearing from is Charles Oppenheimer. He is the founder of the Oppenheimer Project, which advocates for reducing existential risks by pursuing non-zero-sum policies. Charles?
Okay, thanks, Jack. Further introducing myself, I'm from the Oppenheimer family, and I kind of grew up with this feeling and being told that the threat of nuclear weapons is I should have some ability to affect that. And I think that's the main problem that we have with nuclear weapons, that in dealing with a problem that big and that scary, it's very hard to see how individuals can take any discussion in the matter. And um, uh, Joe mentioned grassroots activism, which has been effective to some extent. I used to protest nuclear weapons as a child with my family in the street. But to some extent, the decisions really are not made at a grassroots or even governmental level. It's often segmented within the government, portions of the military industrial complex that don't always even give access to politicians. So it's a really big problem, and I just want to share my personal story on it. It's so big that even as an Oppenheimer, I felt no way to effectively deal with it in my life, like in terms of life work. I thought, well, there's nothing I can do. I'll go do some software and business work for the majority of my life. And I really salute people like the people on this call who have jumped in and said, this is a big problem, but I want to deal with it and I want to help, because that is the method of activism that anybody can apply to a big problem. And so I want to turn towards the AI question. So Oppenheimer Project mainly deals with that. Could we reduce the threat of nuclear weapons? And I like to elucidate and highlight my grandfather's philosophy, because what I look at is his advice at the end of World War II kind of gave some first principle advice about how do you deal with technology change so powerful that it could destroy the world. And him and his fellow scientists had a very clear prescription about that. They saw the threat of fission coming to pass. They knew what was going to happen effectively since 1939. The clarity on what would happen on the scientific level with fission was much stronger than we have right now with AI. So I'm gonna highlight a few differences that I feel are there and a few things that are applicable. So the scientists from effectively 1939 knew a lot of energy and probably bombs would be released from fission. And then, during World War II, they threw themselves into the full-on effort to use that in a war, as humans do continually with all sources of technology. But a lot of the scientists, including Bohr and my grandfather Oppenheimer, really started thinking about how could you control that threat. And their advice, as they saw the war winding down, is that they saw there was no path to protect ourselves from nuclear weapons other than international cooperation, and kind of recognize the fact that once your technology gets so strong that it cannot be used in warfare, their only logical solution that they saw as a possibility was cooperating with another side, recognizing that you can't have a dominance of a technology so powerful that it retains advantage for you. And I think that is the shift in humanity that we are still coming to terms with 80 years later, that we're designed as millions of years of tribal warfare to believe that you can have an enduring technological advantage that can beat the other side in war. And it actually ended with fission, and AI, I think, is a modern corollary of that. Our instinct is to have an arms race around AI. It's very popular to say that, and it's the driving force of most of our policy, that we can beat the other side and get faster at technology, win AI, have all the AI, and be safe. It's a very human instinct to do that. But I would argue only in a philosophical sense that that is not possible. And my personal drive is to drive increased dialogue, in particular with the three major belligerents in the world, which are the United States primarily. We started the arms race by not following the Acheson-Lilienthal plan of my grandfather that said we should cooperate and monitor fissionable material. We tried to keep it as an American secret, and that effectively caused the nuclear arms race, with Russia reacting against that threat. So US, Russia, and China are the ones who need to come to the table. We need grassroots activism, but we also need high-level political dialogues and track two kind of personal meetings. I think it's the only possibility. Some of this stuff transcends rationalism and policy. You have to get people together to kind of decide that we're not going to do this. And I think the final point, because this is only supposed to be, I think, an intro, is the where is AI not like nuclear weapons? Joe mentioned the threat of nuclear weapons. I think the scale of the threats in the world, there's nothing that comes close to nuclear weapons. AI right now outputs sequence of characters in a terminal, and people want to conflate that with nuclear weapons, but it's not the same, which would mean a use of escalating nuclear arms race means effectively the end of society. And where AI is most dangerous is the use that would set off one of these auto-escalating arms exchanges. And if you're dealing with things this difficult and almost unsolvable, I think that there's a sliver of AI that can be an agreement period to talk about the threats of AI and nuclear weapons, which is that nobody in the world wants an accidentally caused nuclear arms race. Everybody agrees on that. Russia, China, US, you don't want that. It's kind of a simplistic view of it, but if you can come to one sliver of something that we agree on and say, okay, we don't want to have that, that can kind of bring especially the most fractious parties in the world, in particular US, China, and Russia, together to say, okay, we'll agree on that one area. Let's not have an accidentally caused nuclear arms race. And I think that is potentially the biggest threat in the AI space. So that's a little intro.
Fantastic. Thank you for that really illuminating speech. Our next speaker is Oliver Stephenson. He is the Associate Director for Artificial Intelligence and Emerging Technology Policy at the Federation of American Scientists. He has previously worked as a science and technology advisor in Congress and holds a PhD in from Caltech. Thank you. Oliver?
Thanks very much, Jack. And the Federation of American Scientists was originally founded by scientists working on the Manhattan Project, dedicated to civilian control over nuclear weapons. So this legacy is something that we think about at FAS quite a lot. I want to make three main points in my remarks. Number one, NC3, or Nuclear Command, Control, and Communications, is a complex system of systems that has been incorporating various forms of automation for decades, some of which are profoundly worrying. The emergence of increasingly general purpose agentic systems raises concerns about human control over nuclear weapons. That's point two. And point three, while the US has made various statements about keeping a human in the loop, these commitments leave a lot of important questions unanswered. So let me start by giving a brief overview of nuclear command, control, and communications. NC3 is a complex system of systems. The US reportedly has 204 different components in their NC3 architecture, including satellites, early warning radar, airborne control platforms, and communications networks. This system is designed to operate at all times, including during and after a nuclear attack, so it has to be hardened against against potential disruption. Various forms of automation have been integrated into NC3 for decades. For example, automated alerts of potential missile launches, and we have seen false alerts in the past. One of the most prominent examples is outside of the US is the Russian perimeter or dead hand system. When activated, this system will reportedly launch nuclear weapons if contact with central command is lost, which is designed to deter attacks on the leadership, because if you attack the leadership, you enable an automatic response. Obviously, this is profoundly concerning in the ways that it could potentially go wrong. Now, these forms of automation have generally been simple rules-based systems. If this happens, then that happens. However, we are now seeing the emergence of increasingly general-purpose artificial intelligence systems that learn from large volumes of data. These AIs are capable of planning and executing more complex tasks autonomously and are improving by the day. Now, I want to be clear that AI has many positive applications, for example, for scientific research, something that I've done in the past. Even in nuclear weapons, applications like AI for predictive maintenance probably do not increase risks compared to the risks we already face. However, these systems do raise serious concerns about human control over nuclear weapons. The US has made several commitments about nuclear control over nuclear weapons. We've human control over nuclear weapons. We've heard a little bit about that. In 2022, the Nuclear Posture Review produced by the Biden administration stated that the US will maintain a human in the loop for all actions critical to informing and executing decisions by the president to initiate and terminate nuclear employment. Legislation passed by Congress, which I think we'll hear a little bit more about later, included a policy statement that the use of AI should not compromise the integrity of nuclear safeguards, whether through the functionality of weapon systems, the validation of communication from command authorities, or the principle of requiring positive human actions in execution of a presidential decision to employ nuclear weapons. Now, these statements, I think, are better than nothing, but I want to suggest that there are issues with just having a human in the loop standard. For example, a human could just hit yes to approve recommendations from a machine they don't really understand. AI systems are often black boxes where we have limited understanding of why they produce the outputs they do, and they can behave unexpectedly when faced with new data that they haven't seen during training. This means that we should, in general, be exceptionally careful about any use of AI in high-risk situations, and obviously nuclear weapons are the most high-risk situation of them all. All nuclear weapons states will say that they need to incorporate AI in order to speed up their decision-making. Countries have made comments to this effect already. But I want to say that even if AI works perfectly, I see an increasing risk that we move to conflict escalating at electronic speeds and more pressure to defer to AI recommendations in crisis situations, which, given the issues with AI systems that I've just discussed, I think should raise pretty serious concerns. I want to finish my brief remarks today by saying that I know that both AI and nuclear weapons are opaque. They're often hidden behind layers of secrecy and or technical obfuscation. In the face of this, it's hard to know how to understand what's happening and what we can do to make our voices heard. I know that some of our speakers today will have more to say about this, but I do want to mention that we can all take time to educate ourselves a little more on AI and nuclear weapons based on publicly available information. There is quite a lot that's out there. And ultimately, we will need to educate ourselves so that we can have a voice in this increasingly important discussion. There are many technical details here, which I think it can be hard to get up to speed with, but we have to engage with them if we're going to be effective advocates. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Oliver. Our next speaker is Hamza Chaudhry. Hamza is the AI and National Security Advisor at the Future of Life Institute. And he's based in Washington, D.C., where he leads their federal government engagement on issues including AI's intersection with weapons of mass destruction and AI's integration into military systems, amongst other issues. He holds an MPP from Harvard and degrees from the London School of Economics. Hamza.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. What I'm going to do is situate our conversation about AI and C3 in the broader context of AI military integration for a few reasons. The first is that any escalation that happens with AI and C3 will happen in the context of other things being automated across the warfighter. The second is it explains a lot about the future relationship that Silicon Valley will have with the Pentagon. And the third is any conflict between the United States and China in the next 5 to 10 years, possibly over Taiwan, possibly over something else, will be partly automated, which might narrow the escalation chain going all the way up to nuclear. So what's happening with the Pentagon and AI? Well, a lot. So you could go back about 70 years, so right after the Dartmouth conference on AI in the 50s. The Pentagon sets up the first grants on AI research at MIT and Stanford. For those of you who are AI nerds, you might know about Shaky the robot back from the 60s and the 70s. That was a Pentagon project. The first speech recognition project funded through MIT was a Pentagon project. So there's a long history here of the Defense Department working with academic labs in particular, and increasingly with private companies on the AI issue. What I'm going to do is now trace through the past 15 years or so, or what's been happening. So the first real AI integration happens through the Grand and Urban Challenges launched by DARPA back in 2005, 2007. And there, what they're doing is effectively working with startup founders and academic labs to set up fully autonomous vehicles. And as you know now, that has evolved into a much bigger project on the autonomous weapon side. Now, after this grand project, which goes really well, they make their first big investment in automated targeting and analysis. So this is Project Maven, which I'm assuming lots of folks have heard about. So Project Maven is set up in 2016, launched in 2017. And what it's basically doing is allowing automated analysis of all drone video footage. And the effect of that is allowing drone operators to automatically select targets. And that creates some controversy at Google and Microsoft and other companies associated with Project Maven. Following that, DoD sets up the Joint AI Center, the JAIC, in 2018 under the first Trump administration, which later gets rolled up into the CDAIO, the Chief Digital AI Office within DoD. And then there's a few projects to keep in mind. So the first is called Task Force Lima. So Task Force Lima was a task force that was set up 2 years ago with the explicit objective of investigating large language model use across DoD. And they filed their final report in December of last year, where they talk about various use cases, some risk assessments, but overall a fairly optimistic outlook on further AI integration. And I would heavily recommend that people look into it. The second development is the so-called replicator program. So the replicator program is a program designed to create swarms of autonomous weapon systems in the thousands. And the idea is to prototype the first drone swarm in 2026. So all of this is already happening in the background. And alongside that, there's been a deepening relationship between Silicon Valley and the Pentagon. So you could go back about 10 years and see the establishment of the Defense Innovation Unit under Secretary Ash Carter. And the entire point of the DIU is DoD is still using F-16 software at the level of an iPhone 4, while folks are carrying iPhone 14s in their pockets, iPhone 10s, whatever we had back in 2015. So how do we rapidly accelerate tech integration into the warfighter, which leads to the setup of the Defense Innovation Unit. Alongside that, you set up what's called the Defense Innovation Board, which is chaired by Eric Schmidt at the time, who had just left Google. So now you see this formalized relationship between Silicon Valley and in particular the AI sector, as well as the Pentagon, which eventually leads to more and more developments and the setup of what's called the TradeWinds Marketplace. So the TradeWinds Marketplace is set up at DoD with the explicit intention of accelerating AI-related purchases, because anyone who has ever touched the Pentagon will know that it moves incredibly slowly on acquisition and procurement. And the idea on the AI side is to move as quickly as possible. So we have two dynamics here. We have a Pentagon that's become increasingly comfortable with more and more AI integration across the board. And we have a Pentagon that has a deepening relationship with Silicon Valley, as evidenced by various agreements signed by frontier AI companies over the past 12 months. Where does that leave us? First, it's really, really hard to differentiate NC3 from C3BM, so battlefield management, command and control more generally. There is actually no formalized line where nuclear command and control ends and conventional command and control begins. So as we watch AI being integrated across command and control capabilities across the board, but not in nuclear, we actually don't know if that's the case. In fact, the person leading NC3 for the Department of Defense spoke to this point exactly a year ago, where he said, we just have to be very careful because there's actually no formal red line there. The second thing that creates is more incentives for speeding up on the Chinese side as the AI nuclear races become intermeshed, right? So you can watch the Chinese developing hypersonics back in 2021, which leads to more acceleration on the US side. they develop autonomous weapons. The United States wants to develop autonomous weapons. And there's a general increase of geopolitical tension on both the AI and nuclear question. And then finally, on the automated warfare side, as I said from the beginning, it creates a environment where if a war is fought within the next 5 to 10 years with autonomous weapons, a war at machine speeds, it is much more likely to escalate into nuclear conflict than a war which is fought at slower human speeds, as it were. And then also, Silicon Valley having a greater and greater influence over the Pentagon might create its own set of institutional pressures on DoD to integrate these technologies across the board. That's me, right? Thank you.
Fantastic. And our final speaker, last but certainly not least, is Sneha Revanur. She is the founder and president of Encode, a youth-led organization that advocates for regulation of artificial intelligence. And she was the youngest person featured on Time's 2023 list of 100 most influential people in AI. Sneha?
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Sneha Revanur, and I lead Encode, a global youth movement for a safe and human-centered AI future. We focus primarily on legislative advocacy for AI guardrails and public education as we transition to a future with increasingly transformative AI. At the heart of our work is a belief that our generations tomorrow will be shaped by the technology that we're building today, which is why we think it's so important for young people to have a voice in conversations about catastrophic risk, whether we're talking about AI, nuclear weapons, or both. Unlike nuclear weapons, AI is a powerful dual-use technology that has the potential to dramatically advance the human condition and be used for good. But similar to nuclear weapons, AI has the potential to empower bad actors to inflict large-scale harm. Increasingly, we're seeing these two risks meet each other with the integration of AI into the nuclear chain of command. AI is becoming more and more agentic, and language models are already becoming superhuman at persuasion, so the list of worst-case scenarios here is obviously long. We urgently need legislative guardrails to protect the public and secure our AI future. And Encode has actively been involved in lots of legislative work at this intersection. Last year, we were involved in the NDA amendment we've been discussing in partnership with Senator Markey and Representatives Liu and Jacobs. That was initially introduced into the House NDAA. It made it into the base text and then made it through committee and was passed when it went to conference and was reconciled through the Senate and House versions. The initial language that we had advocated for here was to maintain a human in the loop for any nuclear launch decisions that actually ended up, unfortunately, being watered down to requiring a nuclear weapon to the launch process to require a positive affirmative action. But nonetheless, it was helpful here to have some base level standard, and it was a first step towards actually establishing concrete U.S. policy governing the use of AI in the nuclear chain of command. And that was signed into the NDA for the fiscal year 2025. We obviously have a long way to go because, as Ollie highlighted, even the human in the loop standard that we initially advocated for has a risk of enabling rubber stamping, and there's so much more that has to be done to create more accountability throughout this entire chain. And we led a coalition of experts, including former defense officials, AI safety researchers and experts, arms control experts, former National Security Council staff, and other prominent civil society organizations to advocate for that vital provision. We also saw that voluntary statement from President Biden and Xi Jinping around using AI in nuclear operations, which is obviously also a positive step in the right direction. So that's what we're talking about when we're thinking about the federal lay of the land here in terms of where we already stand around AI, nuclear weapons, and existing legislation. We also have, throughout history, Encode has worked on a broad portfolio of AI legislative work at the state level. And now we're also working on some really, really crucial federal legislation that we think will help protect whistleblowers who want to sound the alarm about risks from AI. So the most explosive political battle we've been involved in so far was around a bill in California last year called SB 1047. We were honored to join the fight as one of the sponsors of that bill, quite possibly the most consequential, controversial, and high-profile bill around AI safety anywhere on the globe to date. One of the risks that SB 1047 focused on was the potential for AI models, and especially future generations of AI models, to facilitate the creation or use of a chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapon in a manner that would result in mass casualties. That was one of the risks we focused on, and we were especially focused on creating some basic standards of accountability so that large companies training massive AI models, oftentimes with training costs of more than $100 million, have to go through some basic due diligence and publish safety and security protocols to keep state government in the loop. And also, of course, one crucial component of that bill was establishing whistleblower protections, and also creating a public computing cluster to accelerate the development of AI at the public level. That was especially exciting because we, seriously, it felt like a clash of the titans with the number of people that we were able to bring out in that conversation around the bill in California. For example, you had Elon Musk opposing Nancy Pelosi. You had this entire coalition of Hollywood actors who came out in support of the bill, labor unions that came out in support of the bill. Unfortunately, we had a coalition of members of Congress and Democrats from across California opposing the bill. Really, it was, again, a clash of titans on both sides. Ultimately, unfortunately, it was vetoed by Governor Newsom, but it did eventually make it through both houses of the legislature and even arrived at his desk in the first place. And so that was a pretty exciting moment for us in terms of how far we were able to bring that bill in the face of pretty steep and really severe industry opposition and really fear-mongering from Silicon Valley for what felt like the entirety of last summer. And so that was, of course, a big watershed moment for this movement here around AI legislation. We are excited to keep building on that work with another bill in California this year called SB 53, which focuses more narrowly on the whistleblower protections provisions from last year's bill and also on establishing CalCompute, which is that public computing cluster that I was talking about. But we're obviously taking this fight to other states as well. We have a bill in New York called the RAISE Act, which is also pretty focused on whistleblower protections and mandates third-party review of safety plans and the disclosure of safety incidents with civil actions for violations. Similar legislation in Illinois as well, and we had worked on a bill for a couple of months in Colorado to a similar effect. So again, really trying to scale this movement all across the country as federal progress on AI regulation stalls. We think that state legislatures will be our best bet for getting some basic guardrails passed. At the same time, we're working on a bill at the federal level with Senator Grassley titled the AI Whistleblower Act of 2025 that would help us establish federal standards for whistleblower protections and sort of set the stage for more AI regulation to come. We think that whistleblower protections are sort of the easiest way for us to roll out the red carpet for more and more bills to regulate AI, and probably a pretty winnable thing given that pretty much nobody across the political spectrum has come out in opposition to those so far. So that's a quick rundown of our legislative work at the state and federal level right now. A couple of other projects that I think are also of interest. We're working on trying to fund a moonshot project through DARPA for really investing in the interpretability of defense applications and making sure that, as we're integrating AI into defense more broadly and all these other defense critical technologies, we're making sure that the models are robust, steerable, transparent, and interpretable. And so that's going to be super important. And we think will also have positive implications for other civilian uses of those models. In terms of where you can get involved, because what's crucial here is building a large grassroots movement around this. What's crucial here is building constituent pressure. As I mentioned, what got SB 1047 so close to almost getting over the finish line last year was the fact we were able to really activate, energize this formidable coalition across civil society. Once again, it's very, very rare that you have an AI bill that will, bring out voices like labor unions and bring out voices like Mark Ruffalo and Shonda Rhimes and Joseph Gordon-Levitt. I think that part of the reason why we actually made Newsom feel our power and even, got him to a point where he had to take a month to mull over the bill was because we had formidable civil society pressure and we really had constituents weighing in. We had, moms and dads and children from all over California talking about the bill. That's the kind of movement that we need to actually get legislation passed, obviously in a moment where big tech is well funded and is fighting hard and lobbying hard against these bills across state and federal legislatures. So in terms of what you can do to get involved, obviously, if you live in California, New York, or in Illinois, there's already an amazing bill in your home state that you can get involved with and keep paying attention to. So track those bills, get involved, call your elected official in support of the bill. Also at the federal level, as I mentioned, we have the AI Whistleblower Act of 2025. Call your senator and representative about the bill to make sure that they're on board. We need constituent pressure at large and building those coalitions to really even form unlikely alliances across these powerful stakeholder groups is what will help us take on mighty big tech opposition with these bills and help us actually deliver guardrails for a safer AI future. So with that, I'm super, super honored to be here today and obviously look forward to seeing the movement we're able to organize for all of these bills across the country.
Thanks so much, Sneha. Yeah, I can personally share that Encode has really been at the forefront of pushing on AI legislation and trying to get some of these, very first protections installed. And it's been both really heartening to see the groundswell of support, like she talked about with SB 1047, and the progress that they've had so far. But it's also been a little disheartening to see that even these initial bills that are asking for extremely kind of reasonable first steps of like protections for whistleblowers and like having a basic safety plan have been vociferously opposed even by companies that had previously made statements saying like we want to be regulated and we're all about being safe and responsible. So to see that level of industry pushback and how much any type of even sort of basic, very common sense regulation has been opposed has been definitely disturbing to see that. So with that, we'll open it into some questions. The topics that we're discussing today, nuclear war and some of the new threats that AI may be introducing, both in and of itself and also into the nuclear weapon space, is inherently a pretty gloomy topic. And so I'd love to know what are some of the areas in the field from any of the panelists that you are hopeful or optimistic about and seeing some progress? And this is open for anybody to jump in.
One thing that I'm pretty optimistic about, not in the sense that we'll make progress in a positive sense, but that we won't make progress in a negative sense or something bad will happen, is proliferation. It would blow my mind if AI can make nuclear weapons, because the digital to physical barrier there is so significant compared to, say, chemical, especially, but increasingly bio. So one thing that helps me sleep at night is knowing that there's going to be many interesting questions around AI when it comes to command and control, strategic stability, deterrence, military integration writ large, ISR, and the list goes on, and happy to get into any of those when it comes to AI nuclear. But the one thing I'm not concerned about is, GPT-6 makes a nuke. So that makes me, slightly optimistic about the future.
Thanks, Hamza. I think I'll weigh in. Like for me, I had to come to this area with some idea of optimism to start with it at all. I think a lot of the people in the nuclear non-proliferation field, it's just like, it's such a difficult topic with a unsolvable endpoint, right? It's actually most likely we're not going to be able to get rid of nuclear weapons, which took me a long time to admit to myself and be like, okay, we're kind of stuck with them. So what are the hopeful parts that you can start with? One unusual area for me is nuclear energy, which I always had a very negative feeling about because I associated it with nuclear weapons, and I read headlines about how terrible it was and how many people it killed and how dangerous it was. And then I was able to reinterrogate my own beliefs on a technology and say, well, how many people has nuclear energy killed compared to nuclear medicine? And found that the same technology itself, if you use this kind of central thing that we have to do in humanity, which is kind of cooperate with that group that we think is an enemy, that is the end point of solving these things. Sometimes I feel like the policy issues are these little slices of like small tunnel vision on a small area, and that feels a little hopeless to me. And then I feel like we can always get back to like the fundamentals of what if we had a future that had abundant, unlimited energy? What if we dealt with things like AI in a way that recognizes, well, we can't really have wars with each other. So I actually do think there's a hopeful future out there, but it does require basically human contact, and I'll use that as an excuse to read a Oppenheimer quote, which I know everybody's waiting for, that I intended to do. So my grandfather said in a letter to Henry Stimson right at the end of the war, August 17th, and he wrote it with Enrico Fermi, Ernest Lawrence, and Compton. It wasn't just a letter; it was a report to the Secretary of War and President about what we should do with weapons. I'd encourage you to read that. Maybe Google the August 17th Stimson Oppenheimer letter. But one point he made in it, and effectively he said that nuclear weapons will never make us safer. And a quote that he said is, "We believe that the safety of this nation, as well as the larger safety of the world, cannot lie wholly or even primarily in scientific or technical work. It can only be established through political unity of the world." And that in some ways seems harder than solving AI and nuclear weapons. How can you get political unity? But it's our path forward. So I'm a little hopeful.
Joe?
Yeah, I think the sort of premise of pessimism about nuclear weapons is actually a little puzzling to me. I think that the record here shows that we should not be pessimistic about that. PSR itself was founded in the 1960s when studies showed that strontium-90 in babies' teeth across the country were due to nuclear weapons testing in the Southwest, and the resulting activism led to convincing JFK to lead the charge on the partial test ban treaty, and that's the reason why we don't have atmospheric weapons testing now. This movement has been very successful, even more so in the 80s, right? How did we get to an 80% reduction in nuclear weapons? This was because there was a grassroots movement that was led by doctors and scientists, but got 1 million people into Central Park in 1982, got some very powerful media products out, which Reagan wrote in his diary. They changed his mind. And at the same time in the Soviet Union, there was activism in a very different way through sort of quiet channels up the power structure, and through the medical and scientific community there, that changed Gorbachev's mind. And Reagan and Gorbachev actually almost agreed to the total elimination of nuclear weapons in Reykjavik in 1986. But what they ended up doing was reducing the number of nuclear weapons in the world from 60,000 to 12,000. Whatever its limitations, right now we have a treaty making nuclear weapons illegal under international law that half the countries in the world have signed on to. I think grassroots activism has a very strong track record. We've accomplished a lot, and nuclear weapons in their history have twice almost been completely abolished, once with the Acheson-Lilienthal, then Truman-Baruch plan in the 1940s, and then again in 1986 in Reykjavik. So I think there's a great track record for grassroots activism in parallel with track 2 activities, right? Inside the room and outside the room together. So I think there's a lot of reason for optimism. I think that Sneha is also showing us the way forward, right? That kind of work that she's doing, mobilizing the public, using celebrities, coming up with strategies of bills that are going to resonate with lawmakers, trying to test the waters about what's achievable at any given time. I think that that's exactly the model that we should be following, and there's no reason to strangle the movement in the crib with unwarranted pessimism.
Joe, I love that, and I really loved all your points, especially the specifics about the policy. I want to raise you one piece of crazy optimism even further than that. I saw Trump on video, as I'm sure you guys did, and maybe part of the audience say, I think we should have negotiations with US, China, and Russia and denuclearize, and that we can reduce our weapons, and then it will reduce our military spending. And that gave me a bizarre, I supported that. I completely support that, even though, I might not agree with everything. That is a statement that I could get behind. And so there can be optimism from any level. So
he says a lot of things. From time to time, he has said good things about nuclear weapons. He's certainly been interested in the topic for 40 years. We would welcome any moves towards disarmament treaties, certainly.
Right.
I just want to add one thought here, which is that if you are even small, well-organized groups that are able to coordinate their actions, I think can really advance particular agendas and can get things up the list of priorities of Congress, for example. So if you don't reach out to your member of Congress, they're not going to know that this is something that matters to you. And I've seen that surprisingly, I think nuclear weapons often do not rise up to the top of the priority list in Congress. And it's up to people, constituents, to change that. And I think it's entirely possible to do that if you make sure you call the right people, call your member, call other members who are on the relevant committees and who have maybe made some expressions of interest of this. By organizing with people, by communicating its importance to your elected members, they can understand this is something that their constituents care about, and then can take actions on the basis of that. And I think it is not nearly as hard as it might appear from the outside to try and make that happen.
Fantastic. Well, the segue into Trump was very relevant. My next question was regarding the Trump administration's actions so far in both the domain of AI and nuclear weapons. And the question is, what actions have been relevant so far in these domains under Trump, and looking forward, to your ability to read the tea leaves and, make a prediction, what do you foresee happening in terms of actions by the US government in either AI or nuclear weapons?
I can give some thoughts on the AI side, and we'll leave it to others to talk about AI, to talk about nuclear weapons. So the Trump administration has been a lot more pro AI innovation adoption throughout the economy. JD Vance, Vice President JD Vance, went to the Paris summit, the AI Action Summit, and gave a speech that was pro-American leadership, was generally not particularly placing much emphasis on questions of AI safety, for example. And I think we can expect we're going to see an AI action plan coming out of the administration in the coming months. President Trump signed an executive order directing the creation of an AI action plan designed to ensure American leadership in artificial intelligence. I think the Trump administration is going to have to resolve a tension here where if you want people to adopt AI systems, if you want them to diffuse throughout the economy, which is a key component of actually making them have large-scale impacts, you need people to trust those AI systems. You need them to actually believe that they can use the systems, believe that they're going to produce the outputs that they think they will, not be making significant mistakes, not be causing damage and harm. And if you want to build that public trust, you have to have an agenda to make sure that your systems are trustworthy, are interpretable and understandable. Otherwise, you're going to find people, as we see right now, people just don't trust AI. They don't trust it when companies say they're using AI. The public polling here is pretty bad. And I think if you want a really pro-AI adoption agenda, you've got to ask, what is your public trust agenda? And that's what I'm going to be looking to see what the Trump administration does here. How do they ensure public trust in this technology, which is ultimately a foundation of AI adoption and beneficial AI?
Joe?
Yeah, I can briefly summarize the nuclear weapons policy from a nuclear weapons policy standpoint. So I think there's sort of two possible kind of schools of thought that you see. One is the Project 2025 agenda, which is begin nuclear weapons testing, tear up all of our treaties, start spending more on developing new weapons, right? Like all of the things that would be terrible. And that's like written in Project 2025. On the other end of the spectrum, we have I would say sort of the idle musings school, where Trump from time to time will say something like, I don't even know why we have these weapons. We should get rid of them. If they were ever used, it would be doomsday. We need denuclearization. I want to sit down with the Russians and make a treaty, right? Like those are the things that he sometimes says. So in terms of what to expect from the administration, I think the best predictor of future outcomes is probably past ones, right? So there was a previous Trump administration, and they were more the outcomes. There was some kind of stuff that happened in the idle musings camp, like the attempted but ultimately unsuccessful rapprochement with North Korea. But most of what we saw was in the kind of Project 2025 camp, which was the administration said, oh, well, we don't want to renew our treaties with Russia because we want trilateral ones with China. And what they ended up doing was almost letting New START expire, letting Open Skies and INF expire, basically everything in the wrong direction. So I'm hopeful that the idle musings prevail, but I don't think that we have a lot of evidence that that will be the case.
I'll add like a couple of pieces here. So one is at the Helsinki summit with Putin a few years ago, he explicitly said, my end goal is to have no nuclear weapons anywhere in the world. Also, what's interesting on the AI nuclear side is the only time that the president has talked about AI systems causing large-scale harm is in the context of nuclear. So he was on a podcast of some kind in the run-up to the election, where he said that his doomsday scenario was some deep fake imagery of some kind being used to precipitate a nuclear conflict. And that's why he was quite concerned about the AI nuclear intermesh. So there's clearly someone who's been thinking quite a lot about this. My sense is that he is going to be fairly interested in principal level trilat engagement with Russia and China, while potentially creating some negatives by pushing other states to arm for the first time. So you can think of the obvious ones. Japan, Saudi Arabia, potentially some country in Europe decides, the nuclear umbrella isn't stable anymore. We have to go into rearmament of some kind. So that concerns me quite a lot, but I'm actually quite optimistic on the US-China and US-Russia side.
Yeah, can I just jump in and make a quick clarification there? So both under our Article 6 obligations in the 1968 Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and in the P5 statements as recently as 2021, it is policy of the US, Russia, the UK, France, and China that we are pursuing a world without nuclear weapons. That is policy. A nuclear war cannot be fought, it cannot be won and must never be fought, and we are all working to pursue a world without nuclear weapons. That's like in shared statement since 2021.
I think that's right. You just very rarely get principals talking about it with that sense of force. So I feel slightly more optimistic. The final thing I'd also say on the AI side is President Trump has talked about AI in the context of national security quite a lot. So you can watch the Vice President Vance's speech at the Paris Action Summit, but also the Munich Security Conference the week after. You can look at the text of the Action Plan Executive Order, and it consistently mentions national security as one of the things that they have to work on alongside economic competitiveness, innovation, all of those things. So one thing that's going to be really interesting is watching the administration delineate some issues as issues of innovation and some issues as issues of national security. And I think with the latter, there will be a much more precautionary approach when it comes to AI integration and AI regulation. And with the former, you'll see a rollback of any guardrails that we've seen since.
Kind of going off of some of that discussion about the international dimension, does anyone, one thing that I was curious about from people's talks was kind of thinking about the international diplomatic lens to this. I know there's been a number of talks over the last few years. None of them have seemed to have a huge amount of, big agreements come out of them, but can any of the speakers share their thoughts on, the discussions that have happened so far and maybe any of the potential future directions that either they'd like to see talks go in or that they are predicting talks going towards?
I can give a few thoughts here. So far, what we have seen are very high level. Well, publicly, we've seen very high level discussions and commitments. And so those are high level commitments about human control over nuclear weapons, general responsible military AI principles. For example, the State Department has been leading on that. I think a stage beyond that, which I'm not aware of the extent to which these conversations are happening, are to come up with more detailed best practices and principles for what it looks like to actually maintain human control over nuclear weapons, because it is a lot more complicated than just a statement that a human will be in the loop. As I said earlier, you can just have a human pressing an approve button, and that technically would be a human in the loop. And so coming up and sharing and disseminating best practices for how you can maintain human control over nuclear weapons, I think is going to be important. And then beyond that, there are formal treaties, commitments that people commit to. I think one of the issues here is that verification is going to be a huge challenge. So being able to say, what is a country actually doing? Because NC3 is very opaque for people on the outside, what are countries actually doing? How can you verify what they're doing? That's going to be very challenging. And I think that is probably some argument in favor of a broader, more distributed public understanding and public pressure here. Because if it is difficult to actually verify, at least hopefully you can have a general cultural understanding that there are real dangers here, real risks here, which can hopefully put the brakes on some of the more risky impulses that nations might have.
We've participated in a few track twos, and based off of that and with some conversation in the State Department, it's quite clear that on the AI nuclear question, Xi Jinping is very concerned. So you could go back to the first Biden-Xi summit in San Francisco, November 2023. The thing that was negotiated by the State Department was fentanyl, and that took like 6 months and choreography and formality and all of those things. AI nuclear was pushed by Xi. It wasn't pushed by the US side. So it's quite clear that he's receiving briefings. Maybe this is the famous Kissinger meeting a couple of months before that, or something else, which has pushed him to be really concerned about the AI nuclear nexus. I think that also reflects in any track twos I've heard of between the US and China. There's a few problems here. The first is the most well-studied nuclear command and control system in the world is the United States system. And I'm not even comparing this to Russia or China. We know almost nothing about France's AI and C3 framework, like absolutely nothing. We know a little bit about the UK. We know nothing about India and Pakistan. We know nothing about Israel. So you're dealing with a huge information asymmetry when it comes to civil society actors engaging on the diplomatic question. The second is NC3, as we understand it, basically only applies in the case of a couple of countries. Lots of countries have radically different nuclear command and control structures, which makes it difficult to have standardized agreements. And then the third is, insofar as these diplomatic efforts on the scientific side are being driven by AI scientists, they don't know a lot about nuclear weapons. So I've seen some track twos wrap up after like 6 weeks, and people walk out and say, we've decided that we shouldn't have AI in nuclear command and control. And you're like, there's already AI in nuclear command and control. Like, hate to break it to you. And then, so one thing we also need is education between these two communities. The nuclear and AI communities need to be talking to each other a lot more. One optimistic thing I can say on the verification protocol side is lots of folks have been looking into what's called compute security, which is this technical community focused on enhancing the capabilities of GPUs, TPUs, CPUs. How do you make the chip smarter, in other words? And some of that can be used to know where the chips are. Some of that can be used to switch the chips off. But the tech stack is going to get to a stage over the next 5 years where you can effectively meter the amount of compute being used on the chips and also be able to tell if the chips are being used for some dangerous computation. So my hope there is that compute security work can be used as the satellite verification equivalent of the AI era for some kind of AI nuclear treaty. But it's still an open question of how long it will take for us to get there technically.
Okay. Did anyone want to share anything else on that, or ready to move on? I see we have 2 audience questions. I want to give them a chance. The first one is Paul Poppinjock. Paul, are you able to unmute and ask your question? Can you on the webinar mode? There. Hey, Paul.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm grateful to this for this conversation. I'm calling from Massachusetts, where my good fortune is to be a constituent of Jim McGovern, who has introduced House Resolution 317 to adopt the TPNW. And I'm wondering what you think would be since there seems to be consensus that we have to back away from the brink, what would be some reasonable low-risk steps that the United States could initiate to denuclearize the planet? For instance, by backing off of launch on warning, developing common verification protocols that all nuclear nations could adopt, or other things like that would allow us to put in Donald Trump's hands the opportunity to win the Nobel Peace Prize.
Thanks, Paul. Great question.
Should I take that one?
Sure. Feel free to jump in.
So Paul, I'm not sure if you're explicitly or implicitly alluding to the Back from the Brink platform, but that's the US-based legislative and grassroots strategy that is pursuing both. So it has it has 5 steps in it. One of which is so some of which you alluded to there. So that's having a no first use policy, ending sole presidential authority to launch nuclear weapons, ending hair trigger alert, also known as launch on warning, canceling the $1.7 billion trillion plans to replace the whole arsenal with new weapons, and pursuing a multilateral verifiable treaty for total multilateral nuclear disarmament. So I think Back from the Brink is the way of pursuing a world without nuclear weapons, including steps that would make us safer while we're working on it. And that's a movement that's been very successful in gaining the support of state legislatures, city governments around the country, municipalities, NGOs, elected officials, more than 40 House reps at this point. So yes, I think that's the avenue in the US.
Thanks, Joe.
I'll add there, and something I was quite impressed by with HR 317 is a conversation we just don't have enough in the nuclear disarmament community, which is there's a clear economic reason why we have this nuclear weapons architecture, right? Like, there's jobs in states, like especially the Dakotas, Montana, which are being maintained in the tens of thousands because of the nuclear weapons enterprise. And that's why I was very happy that Jim McGovern's bill has a whole plan for economic transition for anyone who's touching the nuclear weapon system. And I think that's a conversation we should have a lot more in these spaces.
That's a really great point. Let's see. I think we have time for another audience question. Peter Metz, next person with their hand raised. Peter?
Hi, this is Peter Metz, and I don't know how to turn my picture on because you haven't given me controls for it, but that's okay. That's my tugboat. I don't want to undermine my conviction that the world will only be truly safe from nuclear weapons when we have found a way to eliminate them very securely by asking this question, but I'm nevertheless going to ask, how can we use AI to make the whole enterprise safer? And should we be sponsoring a contest for AI invention to make nuclear weapons and, in fact, weapons in general safer instead of more lethal, safer?
Thanks for that question.
I can give a few thoughts there. It is a great question. I think a few examples off the top of my head. So one is if you can incorporate AI into early warning systems in a way that is testable and robust and allows you to get more confidence in the early warnings that you have, reducing false alerts, that could potentially be increasing in safety. So, for example, in 1983, there's a famous example of a false alert in the Soviet Union, which was flagged as being a false alert by an alert officer who realized that the launch they were seeing didn't make any sense. I believe it was just sun reflecting off the clouds. You could imagine and I know that they have done a lot of work on early warning systems. You can imagine using AI to make your warning system be more sophisticated to say like, hey, this alert doesn't look like it makes very much sense. Now, there are problems there because we have real difficulties getting AIs to do exactly what we think they're going to do. They learn from large quantities of data. We often don't understand exactly how they're going to behave under different circumstances. So there's a huge testing and validation problem there, but at least in theory, there are components that could be helpful. Another example I think that could be useful is using AI for monitoring non-proliferation. And so you can use it, for example, to quickly ingest large quantities of satellite data to look for evidence of compliance with treaties, of materials being moved into places they shouldn't be, to gain more situational awareness in a way that hopefully could be stabilizing in some sense. I think in general, I look for AIs to be useful in situations where you understand the data you're going to get, you're able to test robustly under a range of different circumstances you can imagine the AI being used, and can assure that you understand its full range of behaviors. And I think I'm a lot more concerned in situations when it's going to be used in high pressure situations when you don't have time to test and validate and to check its outputs. And so I think there are positive outcomes, but we should also be concerned about incorporating these systems in high risk situations.
I would also add to that list predictive maintenance. Like we spend so much money maintaining these things, and often we don't know when they're going to go off, right? AI can really help with that. It can save billions of dollars. So I'm really excited about that. The second is, and this is something that I know that some folks in this space are involved in, it's creating high fidelity simulations and war games for policymakers, right? So you can go back like 30 years, war games the day after, all of those things have a huge zeitgeist effect on the Reagan administration. And now you're at a space with AI where you can create really good simulations on what happens between the United States and China in a Taiwanese Strait nuclear confrontation scenario. And those kind of simulations really have an effect in terms of how trigger happy policymakers feel about the nuclear enterprise more generally. And for folks who have been showing those simulations, they can evidence that like people walk away from that, from the State Department, DOD, the White House, thinking this could get really, really bad. And I think we can finally show how bad it can get using the state-of-the-art AI technology in a way that was like very hard to do before. So very excited about that as well.
Joe, did you want to chip in there?
Yeah, I'm so glad that Oliver brought up the Stanislav Petrov story because I was reflecting on that, and I'm super interested to hear what some of the other panelists think about this question of Officer Petrov getting this report of incoming missiles and defying protocol defying the chain of command and protocol and saying, don't launch the nuclear weapons, even though we're supposed to. I think there's something off about this. I need more information. You know, he was later punished for this. He's the man who saved life on Earth in retrospect. And I think in this story and the way that it unfolded, there are a couple of ways in which I could see AI making this more dangerous, right? So one is, so it sounds like on one end of the spectrum, we already have AI integrated into some command, control, and communication. And on the other end, short of the Russian perimeter and Poseidon systems, it seems like at least the US and Russia, the US and China are accepting that they don't want the decision to be made by AI systems. But I'm wondering about this middle ground, where bad information or bad decision support is increasing the risk, right? So there are two ways in the Petrov story where I would think that AI might have increased the risk, but I'd be really interested to hear what you guys think. So one is in the context of detection, right? So he gets this report that there are nuclear weapons incoming, and it turns out to be reflections of light off of the clouds. You know, AI systems are famous for hallucinating, right? Like we could get, because of the, you know, if there's some bad data implanted maliciously, or because of the way that the system is breaking down, we're getting a bad report, and there's increased trust in it because it's an AI system. And then the other question is this space, the time, Stanislav Petrov created more time for himself than he was allowed to weigh the options. And I think either Oliver or Hamza was alluding to a machine system, a machine decision-based system compressing the amount of time to make decisions, whether that would make things more dangerous. So based on what we know about the integration of AI into NC3, kind of what can we learn about this case study?
I can give a couple of thoughts there. It's a great question. I think one is just to emphasize that the Petrov incident in 1983 is an example of very simple, or well, comparatively simple automation causing potentially very negative consequences. And so this was, I don't know the details of how the system worked internally, but essentially there was a series of hard-coded program rules where you take in a set of data, you run a set of steps on that data, and if those steps come out a particular way, you flag as, okay, this is, I think in this case, it was 5 missiles where it had been launched. And that was enough to bring us to the brink of nuclear war. Very simple if-then statements in the computer. This was before the era of widespread machine learning. And so that, I think, just points out that you don't need sophisticated artificial intelligence for automation to be concerning and to potentially lead you into very difficult situations, particularly if you're going to skip your testing and validation. You could imagine more sophisticated AI models going in 2 different directions here. Number one, you could imagine a very well-tested, very well-validated AI system that is able to do essentially what Petrov did, and it's able to say, okay, I've got this warning here. It doesn't look like it's actually makes a lot of sense given the scenarios we've planned for. Let's provide the warning to the user with this proviso that, like, hey, you might want to look into this a bit more. Maybe check, like, before you refer this for a full nuclear retaliation. You could imagine an AI system that is capable of doing that and actually then slows things down, gives people a little more time, is favoring a kind of de-escalatory approach. Or you could imagine an AI system that uncritically accepts what it's being told and says, you've got incoming missiles, recommend attack plan A, press this button to just launch all of your nuclear weapons in retaliation immediately. And so I think it is very hard for me to say AI definitely good, AI definitely bad in this situation. You can imagine it going in 2 different directions. I think if you have a laser focus on AI's limitations right now, as you mentioned, Joe, its tendency to hallucinate, its vulnerability to adversarial examples where it can be tricked by particular data inputs, then that should make you concerned about current AI systems and should make you laser focused on testing, validation, assurance in a very wide range of potentially unexpected situations.
And just to add a quick comment to that, there's actually an interesting field of research. I forget the exact name, but it's basically human-machine interaction and looking at how people take instructions from a machine. Do they trust it? Do they not trust it? And there's kind of another level of Oliver's kind of discussing, is it programmed and designed to be safe and reliable? And then the level above that is, how did the humans with our human psychology interpret the potentially safe or potentially unsafe results from the machine? And some of the results from that field have been interesting, of people trusting machines too much, and that's something I've talked about previously, is people kind of pre-delegating their judgment. We saw there was tragic incidents of friendly fire, I believe, in Iraq with missile shooting down, friendly airplanes that were tagged as not friendly. And so there's an interesting field there. But in the interest of time, we're gonna move towards wrapping this up. I'd love to discuss that more. It's a really interesting thought experiment to think about modern technology and Stanislav's Petrov. But just very briefly from our guests, I think everybody had a bit of a call to action and talking about, the role of individuals getting involved, the role of individuals to get informed, to be able to weigh in on this in an intelligent way. And there was a mention of, specific legislation, both federally, both in specific states that Sneha brought up. Do any of our panelists, just briefly before we close out, want to give a specific call to action? And before I turn it over, I'll go ahead and share that I posted in the chat for PSR. If you're not already signed up for our mailing list, there's a link to get involved if you're interested, for Physicians for Social Responsibility. But for the panelists, Sneha, do you want to start? And anyone is welcome, of course, to share.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, the only way that we win is through broad multi-stakeholder grassroots momentum. There is a handful of bills across the country that we think are exceptional and that we think can really help create a basic legislative standard here, specifically in states like California, Illinois, and New York. So if you're a constituent of one of those states, definitely, of course, call your elected official about those bills, make your support known. Right now, the process is kind of quiet, but I expect that in a couple of months, the conversation around those bills will really heat up. You'll start to see a lot more news attention. You'll start to see a lot more, fear mongering on Twitter. That is a window of opportunity for all of you to have your voices heard and be most effective. And so obviously get involved early, but also pay attention, because there will be, very, very explosive dialogue about these bills in the next couple of months as they make it through more and more committees and pass through more stages. At the federal level, of course, we have the AI Whistleblower Act of 2025, introduced by Senator Grassley. Obviously want to have your voices heard on that as well. So be sure to call your senator and representative. The biggest issue right now on AI legislation is that you have very little constituent pressure. You don't have people in power and people in elected office who are actively hearing from constituents and who are making this a political issue and an election issue. Again, make your voices heard. It's really easy for the everyday person to get involved and to access people in power. And so that's our final call to action for you all.
Thanks, Sneha. Does anyone else just very briefly want to chip in before we close out? Joe?
Yeah, so what Paul Palmachuk alluded to is if you're in the United States, which I assume most of our audience is, it's the Back from the Brink movement, legislation supporting our common sense nuclear weapons policy. At the federal level, that's House Resolution HRES 317. We've got a growing group of House representatives supporting that, and call your local rep to try to get them to sign on if they haven't already. And then they're also if your municipality or state has not already passed a Back from the Brink resolution, you can get involved with your local chapter of Back from the Brink or PSR to lobby for that.
Fantastic. Anyone else? Hamza, Charles, Oliver?
Just to note that when you call your representative or member of Congress, they will ask you what you're calling about. They will log your support. So if you're prepared with just a very short message to say, I'm calling on this member to support this specific bill, very short description of the reasons. And then each week inside a congressional office, there'll be a list circulated of the calls they've received and what they're in support of. And if you can get a number of people to call in support of a particular bill, people will see that on the spreadsheet of calls. The fact you make the call is more important than the length of call. What matters is the number of people who are advocating for a particular thing. So it can be very, very quick, 30-second call. And you can keep calling back as well if you want to thank your member for voting a particular way, if you want to encourage them, if you hear about a particular vote that's coming up either in a committee or in the full chamber. So would encourage people to, if they feel so inclined, to be reaching out to their members of Congress.
Fantastic. Hamza or Charles?
This will sound incredibly conceited, but please check out the Future of Life Institute website. We have a ton of resources there on AI and nuclear. We have the most detailed timeline of near misses with nuclear that you can find anywhere in the open source community. We have the best nuclear simulation called NukeSim between the US and Russia, the best one in the open source community. And we've done tons of work at the integration of AI, at the intersection of AI and nuclear command and control, work in Congress, work with the agencies, work internationally. There's tons of resources there to learn about. We've also given Petrov and Archipov's family an award for their efforts back in the Cuban Missile Crisis and also in 83. So we continue to want to platform people who are working on this. So if you would like to work with us or in any case want to get in touch, please do so. And Jack, thank you for doing this and for the event.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I'll just point to our website, oppenheimerproject.org, and hope to keep the discussion going.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much to all our panelists for joining us today and for speaking. I really appreciate your time and all the time you put in preparing for this as well. So thank you, everybody. And thanks to all the participants who've joined us live and the people who will be watching it recorded as well. We'll send that out later. And I hope you have a great start to your week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.